A doctor helped an Apache girl walk again. The next morning, 500 riders blocked every road out his land. Not to attack him, not to threaten him, but what they came to do was something Callum Reed never saw coming, because in the world he'd stumbled into, healing someone didn't end with gratitude. It ended with a debt he didn't understand, and a choice that would trap him between two worlds forever. What he didn't know yet was that the girl he'd helped wasn't just any girl. And those 500 riders, they hadn't come for thanks, they'd come to collect. The dust arrived first. Callum saw it from his clinic window 3 hours before the riders appeared. A thin golden line rising against the empty sky like smoke from a distant fire. He'd been watching the horizon for 2 days, ever since the Apache scouts had passed through his land without stopping, their faces unreadable there. Eyes following the fence line of his property, as if measuring something he couldn't see. Now the dust was thicker, closer, and moving with purpose. His hands were still shaking from the morning's work. He just finished changing the bandages on a rancher's infected wound when the sound reached him. Not hoof-beats, not yet, just a low rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself, like thunder trapped underground. Callum stepped onto the porch, shielding his eyes against the noon sun, and felt his stomach tighten. The dust wasn't coming from one direction, it was coming from three: north, east, and west, converging on his land like fingers closing into a fist. He thought about the girl immediately, the Apache girl they'd brought to him 6 weeks ago, barely conscious, her legs twisted at angles that made him sick to look at. Her father had stood in this same doorway, silent and massive, while 2 warriors carried her inside and laid her on the examination table. No one had spoken, no one had explained. They just watched him with eyes that demanded something he wasn't sure he could give: fix her, make her walk again, or else. Callum had done everything he knew how to do: reset the bones, immobilize the legs, fed her medicines that kept infection away, taught her exercises that made her cry from the pain, but slowly, impossibly, brought feeling back to her feet. Yesterday she'd stood without help for the first time, her face fierce with concentration, her hands gripping the porch railing so hard her knuckles went white. Yesterday her father had come to take her home. Yesterday Callum had thought it was over. The rumbling grew louder. He could see them now, shapes emerging from the dust like ghosts taking solid form. Dozens of them, no, hundreds, riders on horseback, moving in perfect formation, their approach so synchronized it looked rehearsed. They weren't charging, they weren't rushing, they were simply coming, steady and relentless, and something about that precision made Callum's mouth go dry. He stepped back inside, his mind racing through possibilities. Had something gone wrong? Had the girl's legs failed after she left? Was this revenge for something he didn't even know he'd done? His rifle hung above the door, but he didn't reach for it. What good would one gun do against an army? The riders stopped at the edge of his property, forming 3 distinct lines that stretched across the landscape like walls. Callum counted 20, then 50, then stopped counting. The dust settled slowly, revealing faces painted for ceremony, horses decorated with symbols he didn't recognize, weapons held at rest, but visible, not hostile. Not yet, just waiting. And then he saw her, the girl Ayana, sitting on a horse. At the center of the formation, her back straight, her legs steady in the stirrups, she was looking directly at him, her expression impossible to read, and Callum felt a spike of confusion so sharp it was almost painful. She could ride. After 6 weeks of barely walking, she could ride, which meant either he'd helped her more than he realized, or something else entirely was happening here. A single rider separated from the group and moved forward, older with gray streaking through his long hair, his face carved with lines that spoke of decisions made and consequences accepted. He stopped 10 feet from the porch and spoke in a language Callum didn't understand, his voice carrying across the empty space between them like a verdict being read. Callum's heart hammered against his ribs. He had no idea what the man had said, No idea what any of this meant, but he understood one thing with sudden, terrible clarity. Whatever he'd started when he'd agreed to treat that girl wasn't finished. It was just beginning, the older man. Finished speaking and waited, his eyes fixed on Callum with the kind of patience that felt like judgment behind him. 500 riders sat motionless on their horses, creating a silence so complete that Callum could hear his own pulse hammering in his ears. He wanted to respond, to say something that would break the tension stretching between them like a rope pulled too tight, but his tongue felt thick and useless. He didn't speak their language. He had no idea what had just been said to him. The man's expression didn't change. He simply waited, as if Callum's inability to answer was itself an answer. After what felt like an hour, but couldn't have been more than 30 seconds, the man turned his horse and rode back to the formation. He spoke briefly to Ayanna, who nodded once, her face still unreadable. Then he gestured to the riders on his left. 20 men dismounted in perfect unison. They didn't hurry. They didn't speak. They simply walked to the fence line marking Callum's property and stood there, their backs to him, facing outward toward the empty desert. Callum's stomach twisted. Were they guards? Prisoners? He couldn't tell. The remaining riders shifted their horses, slightly adjusting their positions, and suddenly Callum understood what he was seeing. They weren't surrounding his property randomly. They were blocking every road, every path, every possible route away from his land. North, east, west, exactly like the title had promised. He was trapped, his mind raced through options, each one worse than the last. He could try to ride out, but they'd catch him before he made it 100 yards. He could barricade himself inside, but they could wait him out for days, maybe weeks. He could fire a warning shot, but that would only prove he didn't understand what was happening here. And somehow he knew that ignorance would be worse than hostility. Ayanna dismounted. She moved carefully, testing her weight on each leg before committing to the next step, but she moved without help. 6 weeks ago, she couldn't feel her feet. Now she was walking across open ground toward his porch, and every step she took made Callum more certain that he'd stumbled into something far more complicated than a medical case. She stopped at the base of the porch steps, close enough that he could see the beadwork on her dress, the thin scar on her left temple from the fall that had shattered her legs. When she spoke, her English was careful but clear, each word chosen with precision. "My father asks why you did not come when summoned." Callum blinked. "Summoned? I was never summoned. I didn't know he wanted to see me. 3 days ago, 2 scouts came to your door. You sent them away." He remembered. Now, 2 Apache men had appeared at dawn 3 days ago, speaking rapidly in their language, gesturing toward the north. Callum had assumed they were asking for medical help, and had tried to explain through hand signals that he couldn't leave his clinic unattended. They'd left without arguing. He'd thought nothing of it. "I didn't understand," he said, his voice rough. "I didn't know they were messengers. I thought they needed treatment." Ayanna translated his words to her father. The older man listened, then responded in a long stream of Apache that made Ayanna's expression tighten almost imperceptibly. When she turned back to Callum, her voice was quieter. "My father says, ignorance does not erase obligation. You healed me. That creates a debt, but refusing his summons creates a second debt. Now you owe 2 debts where you should owe 1. Callum's throat went dry. "What does that mean?" Ayanna looked at him for a long moment, and for the first time, he saw something in her eyes that might have been sympathy or maybe pity. "It means you cannot leave until both debts are satisfied." The words hung in the air between them like smoke that wouldn't clear. Callum felt his chest tighten, the familiar pressure of panic starting to build behind his ribs. 2 debts. He didn't even understand the first one, and now there was a second. He looked past Ayanna to the 500 riders still waiting in perfect formation, their presence transforming his small property into something that felt less like a home and more like a prison yard. "What happens if I refuse?" he asked. Though he already knew the answer, Ayanna didn't translate the question to her father. She just looked at Callum with Those dark, steady eyes, and said nothing. The silence was answer enough. You don't refuse, not when 500 men have. Surrounded your land and blocked every road out, not when you've accidentally tangled yourself in obligations you don't understand. Callum ran his hand through his hair, trying to think past the fear clawing at his thoughts. I need to understand what these debts are. I need to know what I'm agreeing to. The first debt is simple, Iana said. You saved my life. My father believes this creates a bond that must be acknowledged among my people. When someone restores what was taken, they become responsible for what they restored. You made me walk again. Therefore, my life is connected to yours until the debt is balanced. Balanced how? That is for my father to decide. He is Nalnish, leader of 12 bands. His word is law among our people. The name settled over Callum like a heavy blanket. Nalnish, he'd heard that name before, whispered by ranchers and settlers in the nearest town, always with a mixture of respect and fear. Nalnish, who'd united tribes that had been enemies for generations. Nalnish, who could field an army of 500 warriors and still have men to spare. Nalnish, whose daughter Callum had been treating for 6 weeks without knowing who she was. You didn't tell me, he said quietly. You never said who your father was. Would it have changed how you treated me? Iana asked. There was something sharp in her voice now, something that cut through her careful composure. Would you have worked harder if you knew I was someone important? Or would you have been too afraid to touch me at all? Callum opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. She was right. If he'd known who she was, he would have been paralyzed by the weight of it. He would have doubted every decision, second-guessed every treatment, terrified of making a mistake that could start a conflict he had no power to stop. Ignorance had let him treat her like any other patient. Ignorance had saved her life. The second debt, Iana continued, is more complicated. When my father's scouts came to summon you, they were bringing an invitation, not a request, an invitation to witness something that few outsiders ever see. By refusing to come, you rejected the honor my father was extending. That rejection requires its own answer. What kind of answer? That depends on what my father decides. You are an ally, an enemy, or something worse. She paused, and Callum saw her jaw tighten slightly. Someone too ignorant to be trusted with knowledge. The insult stung precisely because it was accurate. He was ignorant. He'd spent 6 weeks treating the daughter of one of the most powerful men in the territory without asking questions, without understanding the implications, without realizing that every choice he made was building toward this moment, and now he was paying for that ignorance with his freedom. Nalnish spoke again, a short sentence that sounded more like a command than a question. Iana straightened her expression, shifting into something more formal, more distant. My father says you have until sunset to prepare yourself. Then you'll come with us. Come where? Iana looked at him for a long moment, and Callum saw something flicker in her eyes that might have been warning or maybe fear. To the place where debts are paid. They rode for 3 hours under a sun that beat down like a hammer against an anvil. Callum sat on a borrowed horse, surrounded by warriors who never spoke, never looked at him, never acknowledged his presence beyond ensuring he stayed in formation. His medical bag hung across his shoulder, the only possession they'd allowed him to bring. Everything else had been left behind, locked inside a clinic he wasn't sure he'd ever see again. The landscape changed gradually, shifting from flat desert scrub to rolling hills carved with erosion channels that looked like scars. They followed no trail that Callum could identify, but the riders moved with absolute certainty, guided by landmarks he couldn't read. Twice they passed springs hidden in rock formations, and each time the riders paused to water their horses without dismounting. No one offered Callum water. He didn't ask. The sun was halfway to the horizon when they reached the gathering place. It sat in a natural amphitheater formed by 3 hills, a flat expanse of packed earth surrounded by slopes that rose like the walls of a fortress. Callum's breath caught in his throat. There were already hundreds of people here, maybe thousands. arranged in distinct groups that corresponded to the 12 bands Ayana had mentioned. Each group had its own campfires, its own banners made from painted hide, its own circle of elders, sitting on woven mats. And at the center of it all, raised on a platform of flat stones, sat 12 men who could only be the band leaders. Nish dismounted and walked toward the platform without looking back. The warriors around Callum dismounted as well, and one of them gestured sharply toward the ground. The message was clear: get off the horse. Callum slid down, his legs stiff from the ride, and was immediately guided forward by hands that gripped his arms. Firmly, but not roughly. They weren't hurting him. They were making sure he didn't run. As he walked toward the center, Callum became aware of the stairs, thousands of eyes tracking his movement, faces showing everything from curiosity to hostility to something that looked almost like pity. He was the only white man here, the only outsider. Whatever was about to happen, it was meant for Apache eyes, and his presence was either a privilege or a violation. He couldn't tell which. Nailish took his place on the platform, standing rather than sitting, and the murmur of conversation that had filled the amphitheater died instantly. When he spoke, his voice carried across the gathering without shouting, a skill Callum had seen in military commanders, but never in civilian leaders. The speech lasted 5 minutes, maybe longer. Callum understood none of it, but he recognized his own name when Nish said it. He recognized Ayana's name, too. And he recognized the word that kept repeating over and over in different contexts, but always with the same weight. Behind it, debt. When Nish finished speaking, another leader stood. This one was younger, maybe 40, with a scar that ran from his left eye to his jaw. He spoke rapidly, gesturing toward Callum. Several times, his tone sharp with what sounded like accusation. Other leaders nodded. Some shook their heads. One stood and argued back, his voice rising with passion until Nish raised his hand and silence fell again. Ayana appeared beside Callum. So quietly he flinched. She didn't look at him, keeping her eyes fixed on the platform. But when she spoke, her voice was low enough that only he could hear. They're debating what you are worth, Callum's throat tightened. What does that mean? The debt you created by healing me must be balanced, but the debt you created by refusing my father's invitation complicates things. Some leaders believe you acted with honor, treating me without knowing who I was. Others believe you acted with ignorance, which is worse than malice because it cannot be trusted. They're deciding which interpretation to accept, and if they decide I'm ignorant, Ayana's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Then the debt cannot be paid, and you become a problem that must be solved differently. The platform discussion grew heated. Another leader stood, this one older than Nailish, his face weathered into deep grooves that spoke of decades under the desert sun. He spoke for a long time, his voice steady and measured. And slowly the other leaders began to nod. Even the scarred man who'd argued against Callum seemed to soften, his expression shifting from hostility to reluctant acceptance. When the old leader finished, Nailish spoke again. This time his words were shorter, sharper, carrying the weight of finality. Then he turned and looked directly at Callum, and the intensity in his gaze made Callum want to step backward, even though he knew running would accomplish nothing. Ayana took a breath. They have decided. You will be given a choice. The word hung between them like a blade balanced on its edge. Choice, as if Callum had any real power. Here, surrounded by thousands of Apache warriors with no way home and no understanding of the rules governing his fate. But Ayana's face was serious, her voice careful, and he realized that whatever choice he was about to be offered, it mattered more than he could guess. Tell me, he said quietly. Ayana gestured toward the platform. My father will explain, but I will translate so you understand exactly what is being offered. Nish descended from the platform and walked toward them, his steps measured and deliberate. The crowd watched in absolute silence, and Callum had the sudden, uncomfortable feeling that this moment had been rehearsed, that everyone here except him knew exactly what was about to happen. When Nish stopped, he was close enough that Callum could see the gray threading through his hair, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the weight of authority that sat on him like a physical thing. He spoke, and Ayanna translated, 6 seasons ago, my daughter fell from her horse during a hunt. The fall broke both her legs and damaged something inside that we could not see. Our healers did what they could, but she could not walk, she could not ride, she could not perform the duties expected of the daughter of a leader. Nish paused, and something flickered in his expression, pain maybe, or anger at forces beyond his control. Among our people, strength is measured not by what you take, but by what you can protect. A leader who cannot protect his own daughter is a leader who cannot protect his people. Questions began, whispers. 3 of the 12 bands started speaking of choosing new leadership, the alliance my grandfather built that my father maintained that I have defended for 20 years was beginning to crack. Callum felt his stomach drop. He'd known Ayanna's recovery was important. He hadn't realized it was existential then. You healed her, Ayanna continued translating. You made her walk again. You made her ride again. You restored not just her body, but my father's authority. You saved the alliance of 12 bands without knowing you were doing it. That is the first debt. You have given my father something worth more than gold, worth more than land. You have given him his future. Nish spoke again, his tone shifting into something harder, colder, but you also refused his summons. You rejected the honor of witnessing the first council meeting, where all 12 bands would see my daughter walk again. That rejection, intentional or not, showed disrespect. It suggested you did not understand the weight of what you had done. That ignorance created the second debt because ignorance in our world is dangerous. It leads to broken promises, violated treaties, bloodshed born from misunderstanding. Callum's hands were shaking. He clasped them together, trying to steady himself. The council has decided, Ayanna said, her voice dropping even lower. Both debts must be paid, and you must choose how to pay them. What are my options? Nish reached into his belt and withdrew 2 objects. The first was a leather pouch, heavy with coins that clinked as he held it. The second was a feather eagle by the look of it, decorated with beadwork and attached to a leather cord. The first choice, Ayanna translated, is gold. Take the pouch. My father will pay you what your skills are worth, what your time is worth, what your knowledge is worth. The debt for healing me will be satisfied with wealth. You will leave here a rich man, and you will never see any of us again. Both debts will be considered paid in full. Callum stared at the pouch. It looked heavy enough to buy land, to build a real practice in a real town, to stop living on the edge of survival in a desert clinic that barely kept him fed. It looked like freedom. The second choice, Ayanna continued, and her voice was barely above a whisper, now is the feather. Take it and you become what my people call a bridgewalker, someone who stands between 2 worlds. You will be under my father's protection. No Apache will harm you. No Apache will refuse you, but you will also be obligated to come when called, to help when asked, to serve the alliance as you served me. The debt will never be fully paid because you will always owe and we will always owe you. You will belong to both worlds and neither. Nish held both objects out, his expression unreadable around them. Thousands of people waited to see which one Callum would choose, and Callum realized with a clarity that felt like ice water down his spine that whatever he picked would define the rest of his life. Callum's hand hovered between the 2 objects, his fingers trembling slightly in the fading light. The pouch of gold was close enough to touch, heavy, with the promise of escape, of a life lived on his own terms, with no obligations to anyone but himself. He could take it. He could walk away. He could pretend these 6 weeks had been nothing more than a job well done. Payment rendered, debt satisfied, but his eyes kept drifting to the feather. It wasn't ornate. The beadwork was simple, geometric patterns in red and black that probably meant something he didn't understand. The leather cord was worn smooth, like it had been handled many times before. It looked like something that had weight beyond its physical form, like a key to a door he couldn't see, but could feel standing open behind him. He thought about the clinic he'd built in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest settlement, treating people other. Doctors wouldn't touch because they didn't have money or status or the right skin color. He thought about why he'd come to this empty stretch of desert in the first place, running from a world that measured worth in gold and connections and pedigree. He thought about Ayana's face when she'd taken her first steps without help, the fierce pride mixed with vulnerability that told him healing wasn't just about fixing bones, it was about giving someone back their future. If he took the gold, he'd have money, but he'd lose the only thing that had ever made him feel like his work mattered beyond the mechanics of medicine. Callum reached out and closed his fingers around the feather. The sound that rose from the gathered thousands wasn't quite a cheer and wasn't quite a gasp. It was something deeper, more complex, like the exhalation of breath held too long. Naylor's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes shifted, recognition maybe, or respect for a choice that couldn't have been easy. The leader spoke, his voice carrying across the amphitheater with the weight of pronouncement. Hannah translated her own voice slightly unsteady. You have chosen the harder path, the path that binds rather than releases. From this moment, you are under the protection of the 12 bands. No warrior will raise a hand against you. No family will deny you shelter. No healer will withhold knowledge. She paused. But you're also bound. When we call, you will come. When we ask, you will serve. When we need your skills, you will provide them without question or payment. This bond does not end with a single act. It ends only with death. Callum felt the weight of those words settle onto his shoulders. Like a physical thing, he just agreed to something permanent, something that would follow him for the rest of his life. No going back, no changing his mind. He was connected now to people he barely understood, obligated to answer summons he might not want to receive, tied to a world that operated by rules he'd have to learn as he went. Nish stepped forward and reached out, placing both hands on Callum's shoulders. The touch was firm, almost crushing, and when the leader spoke again, his voice was low enough that only Callum and Ayana could hear. You have honored my daughter and my people, but understand this, Bridgewalker. You now stand between two worlds that do not trust each other. You will be questioned by your own kind. You will be tested by mine. There will be days when you wish you had taken the gold. Ayana's translation was careful, precise. Callum met Nailish's eyes and nodded slowly. Understand, do you? Nailish's grip tightened, because once you leave this place wearing that feather, everything changes. Your clinic will become a meeting point. Your patients will include people who hate each other. You'll be asked to heal wounds caused by both sides, to keep confidences that could start conflicts, to make choices that have no good answers. He released Callum's shoulders. You have chosen to be a bridge, but bridges get walked on by everyone. The leader turned and walked back to the platform, raising his hand in a gesture that brought instant silence. He spoke again, longer this time, and Callum caught his own name repeated several times. When Nish finished, the 12 leaders stood as one, and the thousands gathered around them stood as well. Then they began to leave, not in chaos, but in organized groups, each band departing the same formation they'd arrived in. Within minutes, the amphitheater was half empty. Within an hour, it would be deserted. Callum stood in the center of it all, the feather clutched in his hand, and watched his old life disappear into the desert dust. They rode back in darkness, following the same path they'd taken hours before, but everything felt different now. The warriors who'd surrounded Callum on the ride out now rode alongside him with a subtle shift in posture, not friendly exactly, but no longer guarding a prisoner. They were escorting someone who belonged at least partially to their world. Ayana rode beside him, her silence stretching long enough that Callum finally broke it himself. What happens now? She didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was thoughtful, like she was choosing each word with care. Now you learn what it means to be caught between. The settlers will see that feather and assume you've betrayed them. They'll call you an Apache sympathizer. Maybe worse, they'll wonder if you can be trusted, if you're passing Information, if you've chosen a side. She paused. My people will test you. 2. They'll bring you cases that challenge your skills. Patients who are dying just to see if you'll try to save them or if your oath only applies to your own kind. Both worlds will push you to prove your loyalty. And if I can't, then you'll satisfy neither, and the bridge will collapse with you on it. Callum gripped the residential tighter. The feather was tied to his belt now, visible even in the moonlight, marking him as something he still didn't fully understand. Why did your father offer me this choice? He could have just paid me and sent me away. Why risk creating a bridge at all? Ayanna looked at him, and in the silver light, her face seemed older than her years, because he believes the conflict between our peoples is coming, whether anyone wants it or not. Too many broken treaties, too many stolen lands, too many deaths on both sides that demand answers. When that conflict comes, there will be very few people who can speak both languages, who are trusted, even partially by both sides, who might be able to stop the worst from happening. She gestured at the darkness around them. You're not the first bridge walker he's tried to create, but you're the first who survived the choice. The word sent a chill down Callum's spine. What happened to the others? Some took the gold and disappeared. One tried to walk both worlds, but got caught passing information he shouldn't have shared. He was killed by settlers who thought he was a spy. Her voice dropped. My father believes that if enough bridges exist, maybe the crossing between worlds won't require bloodshed, but bridges are fragile things. They break easily. They reached Callum's property as the first hint of dawn touched the eastern horizon. The 500 riders who'd blocked every road were gone, dispersed back to their 12 bands, leaving only tracks in the dust to prove they'd ever been there. His clinic stood exactly as he'd left it. The doors still locked, the windows dark and empty, but it felt different now, changed by what had happened, by the choice he'd made, by the feather hanging at his belt. Nalnish and 20 warriors remained. They dismounted in unison, and Callum realized this was some kind of formal transfer, a ritual marking the end of one thing and the beginning of another. The leader approached, and when he spoke, Ayanna translated from beside Callum. This land is now protected. Any warrior who sees that feather will know you are under the shield of the 12 bands. But protection has a price. You will be called upon. You will be tested. And when the time comes, you will have to choose which world matters more. Nish reached out and gripped Callum's forearm in the traditional Apache greeting. I hope you are strong enough for what you've accepted. Then he mounted his horse, gestured to his warriors, and rode away into the growing light within. Minutes, they were gone, leaving only Ayanna standing beside Callum in the empty yard. I should go too, she said, quietly, but I wanted to thank you for treating me like a person instead of a problem, for not asking who I was for, making me walk again. Will I see you again? She smiled, small and sad. You're a bridge walker now. You'll see all of us again, whether you want or not. She mounted her horse and rode after her father, her silhouette disappearing into the distance. Callum stood alone in his yard, the feather hanging heavy at his belt, and wondered what he'd truly chosen: freedom or obligation, purpose or prison, a bridge between worlds or a target for both. The sun broke over the horizon, flooding his property with light, and Callum walked back into his clinic to begin his new life. 3 months had passed since Callum became a bridge walker, and the feather hanging at his belt had already cost him more than he'd anticipated. 2 ranchers had stopped bringing their families to his clinic, calling him a traitor to his own kind. A merchant in the nearest settlement had refused to sell him supplies, forcing him to ride an extra day to find a trader who would. But Apache families had started appearing at his door with injuries that needed treatment, children with fevers that wouldn't break, elders with pain that stole their sleep. The clinic that had been half empty was now full almost every day. The test came on a morning that started like any other. Callum was cleaning surgical tools when he heard horses approaching from 2 directions simultaneously. He stepped onto the porch and felt his stomach drop. From the east, 3 settlers rode hard. One of them slumped over his saddle with blood soaking through his shirt. From the west, for Apache warriors approached at a steady pace, carrying a man between them on a makeshift stretcher. They arrive at almost the same moment, and the tension was immediate. The settlers saw the Apache and reached for weapons. The warriors saw the settlers and shifted into defensive positions. Callum stood between them, the feather at his belt visible to both groups, and raised his hands. "No weapons on my land. If you want treatment, you follow my rules." The lead settler, a man named Garrison, whose daughter Callum had treated for pneumonia 2 years ago, glared at the Apache warriors. "We were here first. They can wait." One of the warriors spoke in Apache, and though Callum couldn't understand all the words, he caught enough to know it was a challenge. The man on the stretcher was badly hurt, maybe dying. "Both of you are my patients," Callum said firmly. "I don't choose based on who arrived first or who speaks which language. I choose based on who needs help most urgently." He examined the settler first, quickly assessing the bullet wound in his shoulder. Serious, but not immediately life-threatening if the bleeding was controlled. Then he checked the Apache warrior on the stretcher. Broken ribs, internal bleeding, deteriorating fast. The choice was clear. He needs surgery. "Now," Callum said, pointing to the Apache, "yours can wait 30 minutes. Garrison's face went red. "You're choosing them over us." "I'm choosing the patient who will die without immediate intervention. Exactly like I'd choose you if your wound was worse." Callum met his eyes. "This is what I do. This is what the feather means. I treat whoever needs it most, regardless of everything else." For a moment, he thought Garrison might shoot him. The settler's hand hovered near his pistol, his jaw tight with anger. But then he looked at the feather, at the Apache warriors watching with their own weapons ready, and seemed to calculate the cost of starting a fight he couldn't win. 30 minutes, he said through clenched teeth. Callum worked faster than he'd ever worked before, opening the Apache warrior's chest to find the source of the bleeding, repairing torn tissue with hands that shook from adrenaline but never wavered. The man survived. 28 minutes later, Callum walked out and treated Garrison's bullet wound with the same care he'd given the Apache, cleaning and stitching and bandaging until the settler was stable. Neither group thanked him. The settlers rode away in silence, their expressions suggesting Callum had confirmed their worst suspicions. The Apache warriors carried their injured companion away with nods of acknowledgement, but no words. Within an hour, Callum was alone again. He sat on his porch as the sun climbed higher, exhausted and wondering if this was how every day would be now, caught between suspicion and obligation. Trusted by neither side, useful to both, it was exactly what Nalnish had warned him about. Bridges get walked on by everyone, but he'd saved 2 lives today. One settler, one Apache, both would go home to their families because Callum had refused to choose sides, had insisted that medicine didn't care about politics or tribe or the color of someone's skin. Maybe that didn't matter to the people who hated him for wearing the feather. Maybe it never would, but it mattered to the 2 men who were still breathing. Callum looked at the feather hanging at his belt, worn now from 3 months of constant presence, and felt the weight of what he'd chosen. Not freedom, not gold, not an easy life or a simple path. He'd chosen to be the bridge, and bridges didn't get to pick who crossed them. They just had to hold steady while the weight pressed down from both sides and trust that connection mattered more than comfort. The desert stretched empty around him, vast and unforgiving and beautiful in its harshness. Somewhere to the east, settlers were probably cursing his name. Somewhere to the west, Apache families were probably debating whether he could be trusted. And here in the middle, Callum Reed sat alone in a clinic that belonged to everyone and no one. The bridge held. That would have to be enough. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another tale from the untamed frontier, where choices echo across worlds and courage defines destiny. Don't forget to subscribe and consider leaving super chat to help us bring you more stories. Your support means everything.